Good evening, everyone. Hi. Welcome to Reed Hall on this splendid spring evening. My name is Marie Dorini. I'm the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. I feel like I'm giving a lecture, sitting here, which I've never done in my life and probably never will. Anyway, welcome to the SNF Rendez-vous de l'Institut, where the fellows tell us about their work. Inevitably, as fellows spend the year here together, their projects evolve. Some of them change radically. Others are influenced by conversations with their fellow fellows and take new forms. And then some, like Mae Ngai's, are caught up in the storm of current events. Surely Mae is used to this, as her field of study is immigration. But are you used to it on this scale? Probably not. The author of several books, one of them on sale tonight by the Red Wheelbarrow, on the history and politics of migration in the United States, including the Chinese question, the gold rush and global politics, and impossible subjects, illegal aliens, and the making of modern America, which won no fewer than 6 awards. Mae is the Lung Family Professor of American Studies and Professor of History at Columbia University, where she's been teaching courses on immigration in American history, colonization and decolonization, and transnational migration and citizenship. She frequently contributes to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Atlantic, the Nation, and Dissent, and was for many years a labor union organizer in New York City. So come back on May 13th when she will be in conversation with Curtis Chin about Chin's film on the photographer Corky Lee. It's also a book that, the book on Corky Lee's Corky Lee's Asian America, 50 Years of Photographic Justice is also a book that Mae edited. Mae's current project looks at the prevalence of refuge and asylum in America's image of itself and its evolution from Republican ideals to Jews fleeing Europe and the threat of communism to the adoption of human rights standards as the basis for refugee policy and the accompanying contradictions of welcome and rejection and optimism and shame. All of this under the incredulous gaze of poor Statue of Liberty. What does she make of the current tailspin we've been thrown into recently? What was going to be a perfectly respectable but perhaps quieter history lecture on an essential topic has now spiraled into a very necessary and in all likelihood not very uplifting talk. No pressure, Mae. But now more than ever, we need and rely on your wisdom, expertise, and no-nonsense analyses, and dare I say, resistance. It's been an education being at your side in these troubled and insane times, and we're all lucky for the presence of a great historian on this stage tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, and to Meredith and Sari and the Reed Hall staff, fellows at the Institute, especially those of us from the United States who are right now grateful to be exiles in France. Since we are in France, I thought I would start with the Statue of Liberty. A few weeks ago, Raphael Glucksmann, a French politician, spoke before the Congress of his party, Place Publique. To the United States, he said, "Give us back the Statue of Liberty. We gave it to you as a gift, but apparently you despise it. So it will be just fine here at home." Later he clarified, "No one, of course, will come and steal the Statue of Liberty. The statue is yours, but what it embodies belongs to everyone." What does the Statue of Liberty embody that belongs to everyone? I suppose he meant liberty, or as we in America say, freedom. I am a historian, so I am interested in the statue not as an embodiment of a timeless ideal, but in how its meaning has changed over time, and the meaning of freedom itself, which concept is also historically produced and specific and uneven in its possession, aspiration, recognition. In our time, we associate the Statue of Liberty as a welcoming beacon for immigrants and refugees. This no doubt stems from Emma Lazarus's famous sonnet, The New Colossus, at the base of the statue. Her name, she wrote, mother of exiles, a mighty woman with a torch, cries she with silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Lazarus wrote this poem in 1883, but it was not placed on the wall inside the statue until 1903 and was not popularized until the 1930s. The origins of the statue and its original intended meaning come from an idea proposed by the French abolitionist leader Édouard de Laboulaye in 1865, at the end of the American Civil War, to celebrate slave emancipation. He enlisted the help of a friend, the sculptor Frédéric Bartholdi, and announced the project in 1875 with the name Liberty Enlightening the World. France would pay for the statue as a gift to the United States, and the United States would pay for the pedestal. Bartholdi modeled the statue after one that he had proposed for the entrance to the Suez Canal, Progress Carrying the Light to Asia. It was never built. By the early 1880s, when work on the statue for the United States was underway, Americans were already retreating from the idea of democracy for the formerly enslaved. It was difficult to raise money for the pedestal. The statue was rebranded as a symbol of republicanism, a celebration of the American and French revolutions. Still, Bartholdi left on the statue's feet the broken shackles and chains that he had originally intended, a reminder of the statue's origin in slave emancipation, and a suggestion that liberty results only from the struggle against tyranny. In 1883, the statue was still lacking funds for the pedestal. Emma Lazarus contributed a sonnet for the arts auction to support the pedestal fund. Lazarus, the daughter of a wealthy Jewish family, was moved by the arrival in New York of so many Jews who were fleeing pogroms in Tsarist Russia. In a sense, she was writing off script. The poem received little attention at the time and slipped into obscurity after Lazarus passed away in 1887. A friend resurrected it in 1903 and had the words inscribed on a bronze plaque, but it was placed on an inner wall where few people saw it. It was not until the 1930s that Louis Adamish, a Slovenian-American writer, had the plaque moved to the entranceway of the pedestal and, more important, popularized the poem and the idea that America was a nation of immigrants. Let's return to the new Colossus. When Lazarus writes of the tired and poor, of huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and of exiles, she unsettles our conventional understanding of European migration in the 19th century. That is to say, we tend to think of immigrants who came to New York in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the tired and poor of the world. By dint of their hard work and ambition, they prove that anyone can come to the United States and succeed. This, of course, is the idea of America as a nation of immigrants. Lazarus's reference to immigrants as exiles suggests a view of America that is not just a land of opportunity, but also a land of refuge from persecution and oppression. In the 19th century, there was not a sharp distinction between those who immigrated for economic improvement and those whom today we would call political migrants or refugees and asylees. Many migrants in the 19th century were motivated by both economic and political factors. The Germans after the failed 1848 revolution, Irish exiled from famine and colonialism, Chinese displaced by the Taiping Rebellion, and of course the Jews fleeing Tsarist pogroms. The distinction between the economic and the political arose only in the 20th century during the Second World War and in its aftermath, when millions of people were uprooted by the ravages of war. The figure of the refugee was born of emergency, at a time when restrictive domestic immigration laws made it difficult, if not impossible, to respond to the political and humanitarian crisis created by fascism and war. These emergencies gave rise to a new international regime that created the refugee as a new legal subject. For better and for worse, the distinction between economic and political migrants generated new ways of thinking about migration and the value judgments we make judgments about the qualities of different kinds of migrants, and the obligations that states have or do not have toward them. This evening, I want to share with you my thoughts about the idea of America as a land of refuge. It is from a chapter in the book I'm writing, A Nation of Immigrants, A Short History of an Idea. The book is based on the Lawrence Stone lectures I delivered at Princeton a few years back. My previous writings have been social legal histories about the origins of migrant subjects who don't fit the conventional or normative pathways of migration, settlement and assimilation, and citizenship: the illegal alien, the immigrant broker, the Chinese coolie. My current project is a political and intellectual history of the three major tropes that define the place of immigrants in American society: nation of immigrants, the American dream, and land of refuge. I show these are not timeless features or descriptions of the American experience, but ideas produced by history and politics, and the certain ideological work that they do, which defines who we are as a nation and who is included and who is excluded. My hope is that by countering myths with history, by historicizing ideas about immigrants and refugees, we might be better equipped to understand and grapple with the challenges of migration in our own time. The idea that the American colonies were founded as a refuge for those fleeing religious persecution is part of the nation's origin story. President Jimmy Carter famously pronounced that America invented human rights, but I think he misspoke. In fact, religious exiles in the colonial era, like the Puritans, were famously intolerant of other religious minorities. None of the original colonies believed in religious freedom for all. Many had established churches, and only Pennsylvania had an explicit anti-establishment policy. At the time of the nation's founding, the diversity of Protestant sects throughout the colonies made it impossible to impose an official religion upon the new nation. The Constitution's First Amendment states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." But this protects Americans only from coercion by the national government. All of the original 13 states had some form of state-supported religion, some well into the 19th century. Before the Civil War, Americans from Jefferson to Lincoln often invoked the language of asylum to promote migration for nation building. The moral appeal of refuge and asylum both justified practical aims and covered for its limits. But in the age of restriction, the 1920s to the present, the United States became much choosier about who to admit and how to define its obligations to those fleeing persecution and war. The open door that had allowed 50 million Europeans to enter the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries was shut in 1924. During and after World War II, the United States admitted displaced persons from the war, and during the Cold War, refugees from communism: Hungarians, Cubans, Vietnamese. It was not until 1980 that the Congress passed a refugee law that conformed to human rights norms. As refugee became distinct from immigrant, refugee connoted, both in law and in the public imagination, a victim, an involuntary migrant created from crisis. Victimhood emphasizes abjection and the need for humanitarian assistance, which, while providing important support, involves many contradictions, such as paternalism and control. Crisis is thought to be temporary, which creates a liminal and uncertain condition. Another consequence is an erasure of history from the refugees' own experiences, their past, how people became refugees, what they left behind, and how those shapes their lives in the now and their hopes and aspirations for the future. Rather than victimhood, temporary, and crisis, we might think in terms of people being in motion, migrating, if you will, temporally and spatially, along a pathway that implies a past, historical and more recent, as well as a movement towards a new condition, perhaps to return home or making a new home, even if temporary status is stretched over many years, even generations. We might think about history and aspiration, history's future, as the broader context. These contexts are messy and nonlinear, but discernible and meaningful. They define refugees as human subjects and historical actors. So I want to think about these ideas in the next two sections of my talk, one on refugee camps and one on resettlement. For my comments on the refugee camp, I want to draw from one of the largest experiences of refugee camps in American history, the U.S. Civil War. What can refugee studies learn from Black studies? Over 500,000 people, enslaved people, sought refuge behind Union lines, 15% of the enslaved population in the South and twice the number of free Blacks in the North. Another 250,000 white refugees, mostly slave owners and their families, fled in advance of the Union Army in the opposite direction to deeper within the Confederacy and to Texas, where they took some 150,000 enslaved persons with them. There are also at least 100,000 Confederate Army soldiers, deserters, stragglers, and men abandoned by deserted units. See if we can imagine these three great migrant streams meeting on the same roads. Throughout the Civil War, there were at least 250 refugee camps established adjacent to Union Army encampments, as well as on abandoned plantations in areas nominally under Union control. The camps concentrated in two areas: in the coastal regions, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and the Sea Islands, and in the Mississippi River Valley. They walked at night, hiding in swamps and forests by day. They came by boat, rowboats, and skiffs. Waterborne travel made it easier to elude slave patrols and to go farther distances. People often arrived solo and then would go to great lengths to locate and bring their family together. A superintendent in South Carolina reported, "I have found hundreds who had left their wives and families behind because they wanted to come and see how it was. That is, was it safe? I'm going back again after my wife when I've earned a little money," they'd say. And after a month, they'd ask for their pay and for a pass. "I'm going for my family." "Are you not afraid to risk it?" "No, I know the way." Others came by navigating the networks that existed among enslaved people on plantations and hired out in towns across the South, who were themselves repositories of knowledge about the movements and whereabouts of enslaved and self-emancipated people, as well as the movement of slave owners and slave patrols. After the Emancipation Proclamation, more and more families made the trip. This photo celebrates the day that the proclamation went into effect, January 1, 1863. Not everyone made it. An untold number succumbed to slave catchers' illness or exhaustion. But these efforts and the migration paths forged through and by them are evidence of enormous deliberate acts of self-emancipation. Well before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1863, the former slaves were self-emancipating and making their own freedom. Union Army officers referred to the self-emancipated according to legal terms created by the regime of slavery and war. They called them fugitive slaves or contraband or seized enemy property. Because contraband referred to property, abolitionists rejected that term. The Liberator newspaper wrote, "Let them be called colored refugees until we can obtain for them a recognized freedom and citizenship." Refugeeing was also a verb used by slave owners who took their slaves with them further from the Union Army into Texas. The so-called contraband camps were known mostly as recruiting grounds for colored soldiers, but they were much more than that. Thanks to recent scholarship led by historians of women and gender, we now have a much fuller and more complex picture. The camps were nodes of information exchange and meeting grounds for reuniting families. The path to citizenship was not just through military service, as we conventionally understand, but also through reclaiming family and building community, both institutions of belonging and identity that had been perverted by slavery and were now being delivered in freedom. Political theories of liberal citizenship are based on affinities that are abstract: nation, republic, constitution. With the liberal citizen subject, an abstract, universalized individual. I suggest a more expansive concept of citizenship, one that includes affinities that are made through concrete institutions of belonging, family, and community. And historically, the abstract liberal subject is grounded in the reason of white property-owning males, a legacy that denigrates the individual sovereignty and collective citizenship of Black people and others whose histories lie outside of normative liberalism. They are seen as wanting at best, in need of uplift. We might think of the refugee camp not simply as a place, but as a social relation. That is to say, a spatial product of historical and social relations and context that creates the subject identity of refugee. The refugee is a social actor in a dynamic relationship with myriad other social actors in the immediate world of the camps, the Union Army, and humanitarian workers or missionaries. As well, we must include the larger context, including the slave owners from whom they escaped, who loomed as an ongoing threat of re-enslavement. In fact, slave catchers sometimes raided the refugees' camps. And then we must also include the larger population of enslaved and self-emancipating people, extended family members, co-workers, neighbors, friends, and strangers, all constituting a community, a people, if you will, shaped by the common experience of slavery and now freedom. For Union Army officials, the arrival of hundreds and in some cases thousands of self-emancipated people to Union lines was both an opportunity and a burden. Opportunity to put them to work as cooks on construction crews, growing food as teamsters, nurses, launderers, and scouts and spies they sent behind enemy lines. And after July 1862, to be recruited into the Union Army. Army officers also considered the refugees a burden, with large numbers of people, including women and children, to shelter and feed. Indeed, the mortality rate in some camps was as high as 50%. Some officers were kind, but others treated the refugees badly, sometimes with violence. Northern missionaries and abolitionists sent clothing, Bibles, teachers, and preachers. They worked to instill Christian middle-class values like hard work, as though the refugees didn't understand hard work or weren't capable of it without the lash. Missionaries were often resisted by the refugees, who wanted, for example, their own preachers. In the camps, the refugees set up schools, held prayer meetings, and organized church spaces, made provision gardens, and practiced democratic self-government with political wards and their own police force. Anuradha Siddiqui, the architectural scholar, writing in a contemporary context, suggests the refugee camp is, quote, a ground where people make worlds for themselves and where their world-making is conversant with global histories of abolition and humanitarianism. A few camps transformed into settled communities that lasted after the war. The Grand Contraband Camp at Hampton, Virginia, was the site for Hampton Normal and Agricultural School, established after the war in 1868, and then later Hampton College, formed in 1929. But most camps quickly dismantled when the war ended. The former refugees, the freed people, sometimes settled in areas near the camps, but more often went home or elsewhere to unite with their families to establish new homes. And there was renewed activity as the freed people sought to find family members who had been separated by sale and relocation before the war or had been refugeed during the war. Overwhelmingly, the freed people stayed in the South, which they considered theirs by right of blood and toil, to reclaim and remake. So what can refugee studies learn from Black studies? Refugees were not victims, but self-interested and determined people seeking shelter and refuge. They were on the way from somewhere, enslavement, to somewhere, freedom. The importance of family survival, the importance of community. Migration, families, communities, all of these are histories of world-making. At the conclusion of World War II, there were 11 million displaced persons in Germany, Austria, and Italy, including 8 million in Germany, forced laborers, prisoners of war, and 700,000 concentration camp survivors. While the overwhelming number were repatriated, mostly to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, 1.2 million were resettled to the West. Resettlement was a way to close the camps, meet labor market needs of the resettlement countries, and advance Cold War objectives. During and after World War II, liberal American publications presented refugees as good people who didn't complain and who struggled hard to learn English, become self-sufficient, and assimilate to American culture. Life magazine combined photo stories with an editorial perspective on immigration that countered prevailing anti-immigration winds in American politics. A Life editorial in 1948 wrote in support of more generous legislation for displaced persons, arguing that the principle of freedom of movement was humanly incontrovertible, especially for a nation that honors the Pilgrim Fathers and sees how the right to life and the right to move are inextricably intertwined. Life reminded readers of the long 19th century of open immigration, which had receded in American memory. In retrospect, we cannot believe that the Boston Irish ever got out of the Ireland of the potato famines without DP camps in Galway and Cork, it wrote. Life critiqued the standard opposition to immigration, unemployment, crime, cultural pollution, but averred even if all the economic and social arguments against immigration were true, it would still remain a fact that a world without easy cross-border movement is a world of concentration camps, forced labor, and Cold War. The justification for freedom of movement is not to be sought in what it does or does not do for the business cycle. It is to be sought in what it does to buoy up the soul of man. The man behind this remarkably open view of immigration was the publisher of Life, Henry Luce, whose mid-20th century media empire also included Time magazine and Sports Illustrated. Luce was born in Shandong, China, to Presbyterian missionaries and educated at Hotchkiss and Yale. He was a fierce advocate of the United States as a global force for democracy and a bulwark against communism. He coined the idea of the American century in 1941, which foretold American global influence traveling as much through consumer goods and mass culture as through hard geopolitics. He was an ardent anti-communist, but at least was consistent insofar as he believed the United States had to practice democracy in order to preach it. For example, he was a leading figure in the campaign to end Chinese exclusion. Reflecting Luce's general ethos that mixed human rights, assimilation, and Cold War politics, Life published dozens of stories that humanized refugees and made them knowable to Americans. A cover story in 1948 documented the arrival of the first group that came under the Displaced Persons Act. They were 813 in number, described as survivors of concentration camps and refugees from Russian persecution. Poles, Lithuanians, and others. Half were Catholic, less than a quarter were Jews. Farm workers, professors, millers, dentists, and ballet dancers. All grateful, Life said, that they had been given a free ride to its shore. They emphasized that they already had homes and jobs prepared for them by relatives or humanitarian agencies. 1 year later, Life followed up with the same displaced persons. They had quickly adjusted to a strange and free country, it wrote. For example, Vaclaus, now Vince Paplakis from Poland, is still amazed at the good fortune that has come to his family. He works as a mechanic, and his son and his wife also have jobs. Their combined income of $85 a week feeds the family and pays for their 3-room apartment. Their new stove is paid for. The refrigerator will be soon. Vince is devoted to his new homeland. Of course, we don't know what Vince and the other DPs really thought. Other writers, especially among the refugees themselves, address the difficulties associated with moving on, especially the shame from the stigma of being a refugee and pressure to forget the past. At the start of her famous essay, We Refugees, written in 1943, Hannah Arendt declares, "In the first place, we don't like to be called refugees because the label reduced people who had once been full human beings, people with families, homes, beliefs, professions, all that constitutes a personal identity, to beggars. What's more, they are victims whose experience is literally unspeakable. We were told to forget," she wrote, "and we forgot quicker than anybody could ever imagine. In order to forget more efficiently, we rather avoid any allusion to concentration or internment camps we experience in nearly all European countries. It might be interpreted as pessimism or lack of confidence in the new homeland. Besides, how often have we been told that nobody wants to listen to all that? Apparently, nobody wants to know that contemporary history has created a new kind of human being, the kind that are put in concentration camps by their foes and internment camps by their friends. Even amongst ourselves, we don't speak about this past." Arendt was suspicious of the optimism espoused in public discourse and imbibed by the refugees. This insane optimism, she wrote, is next door to despair. There are those odd optimists among us who, having made a lot of optimistic speeches, go home and turn on the gas. They seem to prove that our proclaimed cheerfulness is based on a dangerous readiness for death. Arendt raised the ontological problem of defining oneself through forgetting both one's former life, that we were once somebodies, and the horrors that stripped it away. She writes, "Sometimes I imagine that at least nightly we think of our dead, or we remember the poems that we once loved. But such thoughts cannot bear the light of day." Not all refugees veered between these extremes of optimism and despair. Many, perhaps even most, struggled and persevered, nor did they forget the lives and families they had left behind or lost in the war. Katja Molodowsky wrote From Lublin to New York, a novel that was first serialized in New York's Morning Journal, a Yiddish newspaper, in 1941, and translated into English in 2018. It is written in the form of a year-long journal by a 20-year-old woman, Rivka Zilberg, who leaves Lublin, Poland, on the eve of the German invasion. She is taken in by her late mother's sister and their family in New York's Lower East Side. Rivka's relatives' sponsorship was a condition for her admission to the United States, yet they act in ways that are unkind. They laugh at her clothes and ask her to clean the house and to shine her teenage cousin's shoes, which she finds humiliating. They make little effort to communicate with or understand her. They expect that Rivka will simply figure out how to fit in. They are ambivalent about helping her get a job. They take advantage of her as unpaid domestic help, but they also resist her presence as though she were an intruder. After 2 weeks in America, it's New Year's Day, and Rivka writes, "Last night everyone went out to have a good time. My aunt and uncle went to play cards at Mrs. Shore's apartment. Selma and her boy went off to dance. Marvin went to Times Square. I didn't want to go anywhere. It's a dreadful day for me. A year ago, my mother was alive. I never imagined that within a year I would be in a strange house, alone, living on charity, or that I wouldn't even know what happened to my father, my brother, or my home. I never imagined that I would be a refugee. What a horrible word, refugee. The word is a curse. It probably comes from refuse, garbage. A refugee is truly cursed, discarded, and worthless." Rivka is not a pious Jew, but she is put off by the materialism of those around her, the women's preoccupations with fashion and makeup, the self-satisfied boys who want dates, everyone's fixation with social status. She does not aspire to be like them. No one actually tells Rivka to forget the past, but no one asks her about her life in Poland either. Nor do people want to talk about the news reports from Europe that young men in Poland, including possibly Rivka's brother, are being sent to Germany to work as slaves. Rivka is bewildered that the Lublin Ladies Society's charitable fundraiser for the crisis in Poland is a festive event with lots of cake and no discussion of war. In Molodowsky's story, it is the American Jews, not the refugees, who, if not willfully forgetting, are willfully ignorant. Rivka slowly learns English and awkwardly prods her family's contacts to help her find work, first in a laundry and then in a garment factory. She is proud to earn her first dollar, the occasion making her feel like a citizen. She makes a few friends, learns to dance and go to the movies, and agrees to marry a boy who is kind to her. Perhaps most important, he listens to her talk about her home and family in Poland, and her father's values of honesty and modesty that she tries to honor in the land of the dollar. He doesn't tell her to forget, but he doesn't want her to worry either. "Don't think so much," he says. Rivka Zilberg sits uneasily between life's cheerfully assimilating refugees and Arendt's depressive amnesiacs. Though a fictional character, she may be the truer refugee of the post-World War II years. But in fact, Rivka is not entirely a fictional character. The author, Katja Molodowsky, channeled her own life story and sentiments through the character of Rivka. Molodowsky was born in a small town, a shtetl, in 1894 in Lithuania. She went to Warsaw to train to be a Hebrew teacher, as was her father, but then, shortly thereafter, living in Kiev, decided to be a writer. She moved among social activists whose language was Yiddish, and from the Zionist camp to the socialist and communist camp. She narrowly escaped a pogrom in Kiev in the terror years after World War I, and then taught refugee orphans and wrote poetry, which was her refuge from despair. During the interwar years, she lived in Warsaw, where she became famous in the world of Yiddish letters. In 1935, after Hitler came to power and was threatening Poland, she moved to the United States with sponsorship from relatives, but she could not get her husband out of Poland until 1938. She lived and wrote in New York until she died in 1975, save for 3 years in Israel in the early 50s. Molodowsky wrote poetry and stories, as well as children's literature, and was editor of several literary journals. She wrote on many topics, but here I just want to share with you some of her writings on being a refugee. In Molodowsky's fourth published book, and the first published in the United States in 1937, just a few years after her arrival, called Land of My Bones, she has a poem called Inheritance. There is a sky, and there are stars, and I'm half comic, half pauper, could be a swindler, could be a poet, in borrowed shoes, in a wandering bed. Like Rivki, Molodowsky was surprised at the frightful assimilation of American Jews. She recounted many years later that when she arrived in America, her sister was simply shocked when she saw a patch on my dress. She looked at me as though I had, God forbid, gone naked. The sister goes out and buys her 3 new dresses, the equivalent of a hand-sewn bride's dowry in Poland. In a book of stories published in 1957, she portrays American Jews as having forsaken their Jewish tradition, their language, and their names. They often lose their humanity in the feverish efforts to become rich. She is more sympathetic to them, however, when they gather in neighborhood pubs or hometown clubs, places for rekindling memories and old connections. Though Molodowsky lived in New York for some 40 years, she always felt keenly the lost world of her youth, of her home village, of European Jewry in general. She is the iconic diasporic figure who never forgets the homeland. So even while her protagonist, Rivki, makes a new life in America, Molodowsky makes sure she keeps her memories of home and family. In 1952, Molodowsky wrote the book into a play, The House on Grand Street. Most of it is simply lifted from the book, but she made a few changes and additions. For example, she adds a scene to the play where Rivki's American boyfriend, Larry, tells her not to be sad. Recalling the wandering bed in her earlier poem, Rivki says, "I have a strange feeling, Larry. It's as though I were living in a borrowed, uncertain world. The chair I am sitting on is lent to me for a short time. The bed I sleep in is lent to me for a few nights. And even the steps I walk on lent to me and will not be there again on my way back. Where can I find a reliable world?" And Larry says to her, "Rivki, the world belongs to all of us, to you, to me, to everyone. No one borrows a piece of it from someone else." In sharing these stories with you this evening, I've tried to underscore the importance of history and how we might summon the way refugees think about themselves, and hence how we think about them. History enables us to overcome narratives of victimhood and objection. By allowing refugees their past, which is the basis for imagining their future, history enables us to recognize the human. These few lines are from a longer poem written by Hannah Fuchs, a writer who fled Germany in 1933 to France and then to Switzerland, where she was interned. "We remain human beings, just like you, who feel hunger, thirst. Only tired and frightened we are before we find ourselves anew." The question of the human is, of course, an ethical question, that our own humanity is tied to that of others. We may recognize ourselves in the other. But it is also a political question that goes beyond humanitarianism. The human, placed in history, is a historical subject, a social actor. And that enables us to shift the frame beyond humanitarianism and to speak not just of compassion, but of inequality, violence, and injustice, and therefore empower ourselves to do something to change those conditions in the world. We now live in a world with 122.6 million refugees, internally displaced persons, and asylum seekers. They're mostly from and remain in the global south. Their struggles far outstrip the human rights framework of the 1951 Geneva Protocols, which focused on individual persecution and did not account for mass displacements caused by civil disorder, war, let alone climate change. In the United States today, the Trump administration has all but erased refugees and asylum seekers from the law and from the public imagination. Asylum seekers are now subsumed into the general category of illegal border crossers. The government is canceling temporary protected status for 850,000 people who fled violence and civil war, Venezuela, Haiti, even Afghanistan and Ukraine. And it is engaged in a full-scale dehumanization of migrants, detaining and removing people without due process, labeling them criminal gang members or terrorist sympathizers without evidence and without bringing any charges against them, staging spectacular photo ops that demonize them. In this difficult moment, we might start our response by posing the cruelty and lawlessness of authoritarianism with an appeal to humanity, democracy, and justice. Thank you.
Yes, so you told stories of welcome, of refugee accepted in the United States. What about the one who were refused? And I was just, when you were talking about the time of the Second World War, the St. Louis boat that was full of a German boat that was full of hundreds of Jews and were rejected and came back to Europe, in fact. And so would you say that the Second World War is a turning moment in the organization of the category, first of the displaced person, and then with Carter, in fact, getting Congress approve the Geneva Convention? So how do you, I am always interested by policies, how do you frame the transformation of the American policy towards the category of refugees?
Right, so many of you probably know the story, the famous story of the ship, the St. Louis, with over 900 Jews fleeing Austria and Germany, were turned away at the United States, also Cuba, turned away from several ports, and eventually had to go back to Europe. It went back to, I think, England, I think. At the time in the 1930s, the United States immigration policy was based on national origin quotas, and so it was very restrictive. Very few people could come. Actually, Germany had a large quota that was largely unfilled. So in order to prevent Jews from coming, because it was very much an anti-Semitic policy, they said you could only come if you could come with 1 year's of income to support yourself, because we have a depression here and we can't take people who are going to be public charges. So if you have 1 year's cash in your bank account, you can come. So of course nobody could come. And Francis Perkins, who is the Secretary of Labor and very progressive member of Roosevelt's cabinet, used administrative tricks to let people in. So they said, well, just get a tourist visa and come, and we won't bother you if you don't renew it. And then they created a category of exceptional aliens. So Albert Einstein and I think Arendt, people like that were able to come in. But the law was very restrictive, and there was no provision for refugees at all. There was no even distinction or recognition that people were in a desperate situation. And yes, I believe World War II is a turning point. Even through the late 40s and 50s, there was a lot of struggle in the Congress because there's still anti-immigration conservatives. There's still a lot of anti-Semitism in the Congress. So the DP law is very stingy. You know, you have to have a relative. You have to be willing to work on a farm there's all these ways to exclude people. You have to have entered a DP camp before December 31st, 1945, when everybody knew that the majority of Jews did not enter the camps until after that. So it was very stingy, and there was a lot of struggle over it, hence Henry Luce's editorials. And I think it's the Cold War, really. It's the post-war moment when the United States wants to be a world power and sees that to champion the free world against communism, it needs to have a position in favor of refugees. But it's very limited, it's stingy, it's not generous at all, and it's only in the 1970s where you have really international human rights movement, which I'm not going to get into that. I mean, that movement itself has its own internal contradictions and problems. But in a sense, it's kind of world embarrassment that leads the United States to adopt the human rights norms of the 1951 Geneva Convention and establishes an official refugee policy. So I think it's interesting, it's kind of at the tail end of the Cold War that you have this change in policy. And as long as the refugees were coming from, when in the 90s and 2000s, the nature of refugee migration changes, right? They're no longer obviously political. They're people experiencing civil disorder and crisis in the global South. And so America doesn't want more brown people. It doesn't want more people from the global South. It doesn't want people who they associate with Muslim countries because of 9/11. So Americans become less generous in their attitudes towards refugees. And so I think we have another shift after the 80s and 90s. Yes, Kiki.
Hi, Mae. Thank you
Oh,
for your presentation. It's fascinating. So first of all, I knew nothing about the early history of the Statue of Liberty, which is just fascinating for so many reasons. In particular, the general erasure of Reconstruction in historical memory, in the aspirations for what the Republic could really mean, and the framing of it as having been a mistake. So the fact that it is actually also embedded in the erasure of the original aspirations of the statue is more than salient for this moment. I particularly was struck by what we can learn from the refugees, the displaced persons of the Civil War. And I'm wondering whether that same an analytic that you use can be fast forwarded to talk about this current moment. So you mentioned that as a consequence of America's aspiration, to be the embodiment of all of these post-war things, that was a moment that opened up a more generous understanding of displaced persons. And of course, that's a parallel to Brown versus Board of Education, also
Yes,
a moment. So I'm wondering what we can learn from each of those moments, both how Brown's understanding of what dismantling white supremacy would look like was stingy and narrow, and we are now inheriting that narrowed legacy right now. So basically building into this current moment what you observed from the past, and I guess also what we can learn about white supremacy from the distinctions between the trajectory of immigration and the continuity of white supremacy. Because one of the things that we do know and learn is that anti-Blackness still remains such a core commitment that one of the first things that is often said that immigrants tried to do is distinguish and separate because of the reality of racism. So I'm really excited by your work at this moment. It's the crux of it.
Okay, there's a lot there, so I'm going to just take a stab at some parts of it. Thank you for your comments, Kim. So yes, I think the kind of erasure of the original meanings and the rebranding of the statue is really interesting. I mean, you could say there's a rough parallel to today where our president wants to erase all of history of all non-European peoples, right? But I think I want to speak to the point about this post-war moment in refugee, thinking about refugees and thinking about civil rights. There's definitely a connection. Many of the people who wanted to reform immigration policy considered themselves allies of the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement, the Euro-Americans who wanted immigration reform and to help displaced persons. And one of the things I think that emerges in this period, in Brown, but more so I think in the 1965 Immigration Act and Civil Rights Act, is this idea that civil rights, and you know this, civil rights is a matter of formal equality. It's an abstract equality. All individuals are equal, right, in the eyes of the law. And that's important, but it's limited, right? So at the time, during the civil rights movement, there were people in the African American community who said, oh, that's great, I can go to that fancy restaurant now, but I can't afford it, right? So the questions of substantive equality, economic inequality, dealing with economic inequality was not dealt with by the civil rights era. And there was a kind of ethos of formal equality, I think, that framed that moment. The same framework pertained to immigration reform. We're going to treat all countries the same. Well, all countries aren't the same, right? I mean, China is not the same as Mexico, or it's not the same as New Zealand, right, in terms of immigration. So I think this idea of a kind of an abstract formal equality that frames how we've been taught to think about these reforms, which were important liberal reforms, but we miss the limitations of those reforms, and now they're caught up, right, with us. The human rights norms in the refugee, Geneva refugee law, which the United States didn't even adopt until 1980, right? But they're also very narrow, right? You have to be a person who can prove that they were, or show evidence that they were personally, individually persecuted on grounds of religion, race, ideology, national origin. So it's very narrow, and it was meant to prevent people who are fleeing war, who suffer generalized trauma, right, from being able to claim asylum. Because you had to prove it as you had to show individually scars of torture on your body, or through some psychiatric examination, which is also interesting, right? And so this idea that a refugee was an individual who was persecuted, it was meant to keep out, you could say it was meant to keep out people who were like criminals, right? And who, if you just had a general category, criminals might come in. But it was actually meant to keep out people fleeing from war, especially in places outside of Europe.
I was going to ask a similar question, but Kimberly got there before me. But I want to continue in the same vein. Actually, one of the things that I really appreciate about what you've just presented is that going back to the end of the Civil War, right, and the fact that there is an internal, very specific American history around the very idea of refugees, right? There's a way to understand the Civil War in terms of the fight to abolish slavery, but then there's also that connection in with how people were fleeing across the different state lines, things like that. So again, it's a case for why the work of history is important, right? I don't know, given the contemporary moment that we're in, do you see us digging any deeper into this kind of work? I mean, I saw the archives that you were looking at. I mean, there's all of this dismantling of state structures that allow for us to be able to have the tools to be able to do this kind of work. We're touching the surface of it. Are we at the risk of having another erasure in the moment of trying to recover some of this history?
I mean, some of our problem is that, I mean, there's like over 100 million people who are displaced in the world, and fewer than 1% of them ever get resettled. Anuradha Siddiqui, who I quote, wrote a book about the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya, where there's like 500,000 people, mostly from Somalia. 3 generations since the 1990s, 3 generations in those camps. And there's a whole world of businesses and schools and, activity that goes on there. People who arrive there as children are now having babies there. It's amazing. So, Americans don't even see any of that, right? And that's an interesting case because the Somali refugees that go to Kenya initially went from civil war and disorder, but then came because of drought and climate difficulties, and cannot go back because they cannot make a living now because of the climate conditions of drought. And so, this seems to be a perpetual problem, and I think for us in America, in the global north, I think climate is really important in terms of thinking about the trajectory of refugee migration. Because that's what's coming into Europe, it's what's coming across the Mediterranean, it's what's coming to the United States. The people coming from Central America, it's both violence that they're fleeing, but also years and years of drought, right? And the farmers cannot make a living anymore. And so climate migration is already a major force in driving people who flee their homelands, and we don't have any way to deal with it except what Trump is doing and what other countries are also doing. They're just closing the door, shutting the door. And what are we going to do about that? Can we in the global north share with people in the global south? That's the question of our age, right? Can we share with the rest of the world?
This is totally interesting, and particularly those refugee camps during the Civil War, which I didn't know about. And I wonder, what about what's the terminology? So those people are called refugees, because all the terminology that we always use, sometimes there's a distinction between refugees and immigrants, that some of them are political, the other are economic. But also the term refugees sometimes is used to, you have to cross an international border. And so some people don't want to be called refugees if it's just been an internal movement. There's displacement. So there are a lot of, I'm curious as to what's in the sources that you've looked at. What are the terms?
So, right. So, Professor Green, those are all our contemporary definitions, right? Political, economic, state, crossing a state line, a state boundary, et cetera, et cetera. In the 19th century, none of that mattered. People moved because they wanted to move for a variety of reasons, right? Some political, some economic. And I think during the Civil War, they first called the I call them self-emancipated people who arrived at the Union Army lines. They called them contraband. Now, that was actually, it's insulting because it means property, but it was actually a clever decision made by the Army general who was in command of the Fort Monroe near Hampton Roads in Virginia. The Confederate Army had been defeated nearby, and there were, hadn't yet been defeated, but there were 3 enslaved men who had been impressed to work on Confederate fortifications who escaped and showed up at Fort Monroe. And General Butler didn't want to return them. So he said, but under the Fugitive Slave law, he was supposed to return them. So he said, no, they are contraband. They are enemy contraband, so I'm not going to return them because it's enemy contraband. So they use this kind of term of art to justify it, allowing enslaved people or people escaping enslavement to come into Union lines. And then ultimately a policy was, a general order was issued that allowed Union officers to not return enslaved people who showed up at their camps. And then they just came in the hundreds and thousands. They just came at great risk to themselves. So they were called contraband. As you saw in some of those pictures, they were called contraband camps. And the abolitionists said, well, we don't want to call them contraband because they're not property. So we'll call them colored refugees. And refugee was a word. Refugee was a word then. Refugee was a word actually in the American Revolutionary War. One of the first acts of the Congress was a refugee act that gave land to certain Canadians who had fought on the American side. They gave them, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of acres in Ohio. It's called the Refugee Act. So the word refugee was in circulation, but it had a more general meaning, I think, of somebody displaced by war. So the white people fleeing the Union Army, leaving their plantations, they were called refugees. And so the abolitionists said, well, we'll call these people colored refugees to distinguish them from the white refugees. But it was a term better than contraband, right?
So first, thank you so much for that talk, Mae. It was just beautifully crafted, deeply researched, just so smart. It reminds me why you are truly one of the great historians of immigration of our generation. So thank you. But I want to ask you a question about the current moment, not about what policy proposals your historical research might lead to or new perspectives on the present that your work might have done, but how has this moment shaped the way you're writing this book? What are some of the ways, if at all, you've had to rethink the story you want to tell in the context of what we're encountering?
You know, there was a moment I had a pause that, when I started this book, there was, problems with deportations and nativism. But we've entered a territory now that is just it's just horrible, right? And so part of me feels that, to write a critical appraisal of the liberal narrative of inclusion might not be the best thing right now. Maybe we should, not make that the target of our critical analysis. But on the other hand, I think I can frame it, I want to frame it as I suggested in my talk, as why we need history. Because if we can understand that things like Nation of Immigrants is not a timeless ideal, then we can think of ways to address our moment today. So I like the phrase that is taken from a poem that is the name of an immigrant rights group in New York and other places called Make the Road. And the idea is that it's like, seeker, do not ask where is the road. We make the road by walking. And I think it's a beautiful, I'm not quoting it well, I mangled it. But the idea is that people make history. People change the world through their own actions. And if we can somehow get to that idea, obviously people are being horribly victimized right now, but if we can not see them merely as victims, but see them as social actors, as historical actors, and we can say that hopefully over time, the people will make a different world. And it might be through a lot of suffering and deaths and internments and rendition. What's going on now is so horrific. But if we have as our core principle, make the road, that we make the road will unfold before us as we make it. That's the kind of ethos I want to embrace. And I don't know what the road is. You know, right now, I think we just want to stop the cruelty and the lawlessness. So I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to write the book. You might have seen the most of it here.
Fair enough.
Okay, about 45 years ago, which is starting not to seem like so much of a long time to me, but I can remember very well that there were lots of people trying to be recognized with refugee status arriving on the southwestern border of the United States from El Salvador mostly, and a few other neighboring countries, Guatemala, etc. I knew that then. I was following the politics of it, but I wasn't aware at the time that there was a recent law passed under Carter, which supposedly opened up new avenues for refugees. So I guess the question would be, how did the Reagan administration in those days
The which administration?
The Reagan administration, if you study this, what kind of subterfuges did they come up with to avoid, enforcing the law that has just so recently been passed by Congress? How did that happen? What excuses did they find not to recognize war refugees, civil war refugees from Central America as actual refugees? Early 80s.
Well, that's much more recent, right? I mean, well, no, that's true. I mean, the refugees coming in from Central America in the 80s, right? That's when we had our first sanctuary movement, right, in the United States. In Texas and in the Southwest, communities became sanctuary workers, right? And they went into the desert and they helped rescue people and took them to churches and gave them refuge. But that was a grassroots movement, right? Nothing like we even see more recently with sanctuary cities and jurisdictions and things like that. But there was a lot of pushback against them from the government, right? They arrested people. They said they were harboring fugitives and things like this. So I think that, what's happening now is, I want to tell you, I'm going to diverge a tiny bit. I think, we're so appalled by what's happening in America right now. It's just this rapid, lightning speed destruction of our democracy and our institutions, science, our universities, et cetera, et cetera. Interestingly, in refugee, immigration matters, we have these spectacular arrests, right? This sending of Venezuelans to a torture prison in El Salvador because they have tattoos, and the arrest and detainment of students who were sympathetic to Palestinians. Those have occupied these are spectacles, right? And they are warnings about what they want to do to everybody. But on the ground, there's a lot of fear in the cities and in communities, but there's also a lot of organizing going on that does not make the headlines. So groups like I mentioned, Make the Road and other immigrant rights groups, they do massive trainings in the community, know your rights. There's a whole know your rights movement out there. And the city of Chicago, officially, the mayor, the city, and the Board of Education did know your rights trainings as soon as Trump was elected, as soon as he was inaugurated, because they had promised they were going to go to Chicago first and round up people. And they had trouble doing it. And Tom Homan complained that city of Chicago thwarted the ICE, made it difficult for them to pick up people because of the publicity that the mayor had done on the radio and on the buses and everything. So it's not that it's a good situation, but know your rights is very simple. Don't open the door and don't talk to anyone. Don't open the door and don't talk to anyone. Unless they have a warrant with your name on it, do not open the door, do not talk to anyone. And it was effective to an extent, right? And when Trump was first elected, I was at Cornell University in upstate New York giving a talk, and there were all these immigrant rights people there. And they said, the immigrant rights groups and the churches are organized. So all the farm workers are in a text messaging system. And if ICE is in a certain area, all the workers get a text. Don't go over there. If you work there, don't go to work today. Stay home. So they're they're connected, and it's the Catholic Church who's doing this in the countryside, right, in upstate New York. The meatpacking workers union, where there are a lot of undocumented workers in the Midwest. Now that industry is not, the unionization levels have fallen, but the union trained their workers and the employers in the factories. Don't let them in the factory. They told the employers, if they don't have a warrant with a name on it, don't let them in your factory. So they worked with the companies and they worked with the workers. They said, okay, if they come in, you select one worker, one representative who will speak for everybody. Everybody else says nothing, and your one person will say, we're not talking to you. That takes a tremendous amount of discipline to do something like that if ICE comes into the factory, right? So there's all this organizing that's going on the ground that we don't know about because it's not in the newspapers, and it's not going to stop the whole thing, the entire steamroller, but actually every resistance, every act of resistance matters, right? And so I think, those little things give me hope that the people are making their road. Okay, so thank you very much for coming and for your attention and your patience. Thank you.